2 weeks ago, CNN reported on something that was bothering Trump's legal team: the unusual silence from former Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. Trump lawyers at that point were totally in the dark about whether Meadows was cooperating with special counsel Jack Smith's two investigations, one into Trump's actions around January 6th and the other about his handling of classified documents down at Mar-a-Lago. One Trump advisor told CNN, "No one really knows what Meadows is doing." Then last week, it was the New York Times picking up on a similar thread. Meadows' silence has caused suspicion and frustration in Trump's orbit, particularly after the revelation that the special counsel has a 2021 recording where Trump admits to possessing a classified document during a meeting about Mark Meadows' memoir. According to the Times, the existence of the recording opens up new questions, including what role Mr. Meadows might be playing in providing information to investigators. Now, for weeks, a central question in Trump legal world has been, where in the world is Mark Meadows and what is he up to? And now we have an answer, or at least a big part of an answer. Today, the New York Times reports that Mr. Mark Meadows has testified before a federal grand jury. ABC News reports tonight that as part of his testimony, investigators asked Meadows about both of the special counsel's probes, Mar-a-Lago and January 6th. In terms of timing, we do not yet know when Mr. Meadows testified, but the bottom line is that we do now know that the man who was there for pivotal meetings leading up to January 6th, the man who was one of Trump's representatives to the National Archives as it tried to obtain Trump's presidential records, that guy has spoken under oath to a federal grand jury. Joining me now is Congressman Jamie Raskin, Democrat from Maryland, former member of the January 6th committee and the ranking member of the House Oversight Committee. Congressman, thank you so much for being here tonight. As someone who knows the January 6th congressional investigation so well, I wonder what topics were off limit to your committee because Mr. Meadows was claiming executive privilege and that presumably are not going to be off limit to the special counsel that you'd like to know about.
Well, you'll recall that Mark Meadows pulled the plug on his participation with the committee when Donald Trump blew his top. Originally, Meadows turned over thousands of texts and different communications, and we were expecting to have him come in and to pursue it. But Donald Trump put an end to all of that, and they made the assertion of executive privilege, which, of course, we didn't accept because executive privilege doesn't cover criminal activity, and he wasn't acting as a lawyer, so attorney-client privilege didn't operate. But in any event, look, Mark Meadows was there from the beginning, so he would have been privy to conversations that Donald Trump was engaged in about all of his efforts to overthrow the presidential election of 2020. And so that would include trying to get Vice President Pence to step outside of his constitutional role and just to proclaim Donald Trump the victor or kick the whole election into the House of Representatives for a so-called contingent election. He'd be perfectly well aware of and perhaps integrally involved in the efforts to get the Georgia Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, just to find Trump thousands of votes that didn't exist, the efforts to get the state legislatures to oust majorities for Joe Biden and just substitute slates of Donald Trump electors. So he would have been aware of all of that. But he also was clearly privy to the conversations and the actions surrounding the violent insurrection that took place at the Capitol. And you'll recall that Cassidy Hutchinson quoted Mark Meadows to the effect of President Trump was not trying to stop the ongoing insurrection that had laid siege to the Capitol. You'll recall some awkward questioning of the White House counsel, Pat Cipollone, where Liz Cheney said to him, was everyone in the White House interested essentially in stopping the insurrection? And he said, yes, I can't think of anybody who wasn't. And then he was asked the question, I think, by Adam Schiff, including the president. And then Cipollone said, oh, well, she was referring to the staff. And she said, no, I was referring to anyone in the White House. And he turned nervously to his lawyer to try to determine how he should answer. And he just said, well, you know, that's covered by attorney-client privilege, and I was talking about the staff. So there clearly are people who understand what Donald Trump's determination and intent were during that 3-hour period when the commander-in-chief just went AWOL. Nobody heard from him at the Army. Nobody heard from him in the Navy, the Marines, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the D.C. Police, the Capitol Police. None of it. He was just missing. But there are people who certainly know what he was saying, what he was thinking, and what he was doing during that time. And one of those people is undoubtedly his former Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows.
Yeah, I mean, and when you outline the number of scenarios where Mark Meadows played a pivotal role or was sort of central in the discussions, it becomes clear that any cooperation from Mr. Meadows is at Trump's legal peril.